And she quotes this: "If you have the soul of a warrior, you are a warrior. All those other things, they are the glass that contains the lamp, but you are the light inside." Let me say that one more time. If you have the soul of a warrior, you are a warrior. All those other things, they are the glass that contains the lamp, but you are the light inside. Memorial Day is a good day for the word warrior to come to mind. And when we think of the word warrior, we think of somebody that has good military tactics. We think of somebody that is good with weapons. But a warrior is so much more than that. It's about what's inside. What's inside of you? What is inside of your soul makes you a warrior. If you're physically fit, if you're good with weapons, if you're good with military tactics, that's the glass of the lamp. But what's inside you is the light that makes you a warrior. We are all warriors if we choose to take on the commission that God has given us to be a warrior. We are defending our heart and our soul every day as a warrior. We are fighting to stay godly. We are fighting away evil every day. There are so many temptations that we are fighting to guard our hearts and our souls every day. And that's why we need to be warriors. That's why being a warrior is about what's inside here. Not the glass of the lamp. We're going to look at a story this morning that deals with somebody being called a warrior that you wouldn't think would be a warrior. But there are a lot of lessons from this story that we can learn that can help us be warriors for God. Where we're defending our heart and our soul every day. We're going to look at the story of Gideon. We're going to be in Judges chapter 6, verses 11 through 24 this morning. Gideon is what we call a judge. Judges were around in the Old Testament before the time of kings. Judges were leaders sent to get Israel out of their calamity that they were in for being rebellious. Basically, after Joshua's generation had passed away, remember Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land once Moses died. After the generation of Joshua had passed away, there was calamity going on with the Israelites. There was this 300-year cycle of, okay, we're going to do whatever we want. Oh, we're in captivity. Lord, help us. God sends a judge. The judge gets them out of their captivity. There's a time of peace. Oh, we're going to do whatever we want again. Oh, we're in captivity. God, we need help. God sends a judge. There's a time of peace. Okay, we're going to go do whatever we want again. There was this ongoing cycle that for about 300 years in the time of judges. They say one of the biggest signs of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Well, this is a perfect example of that. And Gideon was one of these judges that was sent to deliver God's people from captivity because they were being stupid rebellious. When the angel of the Lord calls Gideon to be a warrior, Israel had been in captivity with Midian for about 7 years. At this point. And that's where we are this morning. Israel is in Midianite captivity. And they've been in Midianite captivity for about 7 years. So we're in Judges chapter 6, verses 11 to 24. Starting at verse 11 in Judges chapter 6. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. Gideon replied, if now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord said, I will wait until you return. Gideon went inside, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out and offered them to him under the oak. The angel of God said to him, take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth. And Gideon did so. And the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread. And the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die. So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, the Lord is peace. To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. There are a lot of parallels between Gideon's calling as warrior and our call as warriors of God. We're going to look at some of those parallels this morning. This is the first parallel we see between Gideon's story and our story. Let God determine your potential. Let God determine your potential. There's some irony in the first part of this calling of Gideon. See, Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress. That wasn't an usual occurrence. People would thresh wheat in more of an open area usually during that time. But Gideon was so scared of the Midianites taking his wheat that he had to do this wheat threshing undercover. So Gideon was living in fear when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon. And as Gideon is living in fear, threshing wheat undercover, this angel of the Lord calls Gideon a warrior. That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? This man's in fear, he's threshing wheat undercover, and this angel of the Lord appears and says, you're a warrior. God is with you. Gideon thought that this angel was probably crazy for saying this. Because Gideon didn't think he was a warrior. He wasn't from a respected clan of Manasseh. He wasn't of high status in his family. He's probably thinking to himself, how am I a warrior? But you know what? God knew Gideon's potential better than he knew his own potential. And Gideon could not sell himself short. Just because Gideon wasn't capable of something at the moment doesn't mean Gideon wasn't capable of it in the future. Let God determine your potential. Don't let yourself determine your potential, because you will sell yourself short. You will not let the glory and the power and the majesty of God show if you sell yourself short when you determine your potential and you don't let God determine your potential. God sees more in you than what you see in yourself. Remember the story of Paul on the road to Damascus? God saw more in Paul than what Paul saw in himself, right? Paul was this Pharisee that was responsible for a bunch of Christians being killed all the time. And all of a sudden he has this encounter with the resurrected Jesus on the way to Damascus. And after that encounter, Paul ends up writing more books than anybody in the Bible. And Paul plants all these churches. But when Paul was on the road to Damascus, he was probably like, no way in heck am I going to be this instrumental figure in starting churches. No way in heck am I going to be writing all these books for the Bible. You know why? Because God knew Paul's potential better than Paul knew his own potential. Just because Paul wasn't gifted and passionate about starting churches at that time didn't mean that God didn't have other plans for him in the future. Remember the story of Moses? Man was a murderer, fled to Midian, tending his father-in-law's flocks. All of a sudden, God calls him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses didn't think he was qualified to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. He knew he was a murderer. He knew he was just tending flocks. But God knew his potential better than Moses knew his potential. Moses couldn't sell himself short. Just because Moses wasn't passionate and gifted at the time about what God wanted him to do in the future, doesn't mean that God had other plans for him in the future. You can't sell yourself short. If you would have asked me when I was 18, if I was ever going to be a preacher, I'd say, no way, Jose. No way in heck. But God knew my potential. And, just because I wasn't passionate or gifted at the time, when I was 18, doesn't mean that God had, the same path for me the rest of my life. God knew my potential. God knew what I was capable of. But for a long time, I sold myself short. But eventually, I became a preacher. Obviously, I'm here right now. You gotta let God define your potential. If God's gonna call the shots, and a lot of us agree that God calls the shots in our lives, right? If you're gonna let God call the shots, you gotta let him define your potential. Because he made you. He knows you better than anybody else. And just because you're not gifted or passionate about something right now doesn't mean you're not going to be gifted and passionate about it in the future. Because God knows your potential. Let God define your potential. Here's another parallel we see between the story of Gideon and our story of being a warrior of God. Hardships do not equal abandonment. Hardships do not equal abandonment. If we look at this story, we see that Gideon is questioning the fact that God is present. Remember at the beginning of the story, the angel of the Lord told Gideon, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And then Gideon goes on to question that statement. You look at verse 13. Gideon says, "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." Let me get this straight, angel of the Lord, okay? You're telling me that God is with us. But look at all this stuff that's happening around us. We heard from our ancestors that God showed up in some miraculous ways in the past. Why is that not happening right now? How can God be with us right now? Gideon forgot that his people were paying the price for their stupid mistakes. God was showing judgment on the Israelites. That's why they were Midianite captivity. And a lot of times, we have to reap what we sow, and we forget that. Sometimes we're paying for mistakes, and we think God has abandoned us. No, he hasn't. God disciplines his children. And if he's a good dad, he's going to discipline his children once in a while. He's going to want them to learn from their mistakes. He's going to want them to grow holier. He's going to want them to grow stronger. And sometimes he has to do that through discipline. And that happens through judgment. And a lot of times when we have to pay the price for stupid things that we've done, we love to say, "Hey, God's not here." No, he's here. He's just disciplining you because he's a good dad. That's what good dads do. Good dads are going to discipline you and help you to learn from your mistakes. That's a loving dad that shows tough love. And that's not the only reason why it seems like God has abandoned people when bad things happen. If you read the story of Job, Job almost had everything taken from him. But that wasn't judgment. He was never given an explanation for why nearly everything was taken from him. That's another scenario where we feel that God has abandoned us through hardship. We're not always given an explanation. Imagine you're in a room taking a test at school. There's a teacher in the room. The teacher is not going to help you with the answers on the test. Why? Because you're not going to know where you stand on the material. You're not going to learn from your study habits. Because the goal of that test is to make you a better student. To make you have more knowledge of a certain area or a certain topic. God's given the test when bad things happen. God's given the test. These hard times aren't always judgments, sometimes they're tests. So you can be a stronger Christian, so you can see where you are in your faith, so you can see where you need to improve. So you can see whether you have good habits or bad habits that are helping you be a good Christian. And God's a teacher that's not going to always give you the answers. Because that would be easy if you were given all the answers all the time. And you wouldn't be a better Christian. You wouldn't be a stronger Christian. And you wouldn't know where you are in your faith if God just intervened and gave you the answers on the test all the time. He wants you to be a faithful Christian. He wants you to grow in your faith. And if you always are spoon-fed the answers to everything that happens, he wouldn't be a good teacher. He wouldn't be a good test giver. We've got to learn from the test. We've got to see where we are. It doesn't mean God has abandoned you. God is administering the test. God is there. But maybe He's not giving you the answers. That's okay. He's still there. He's still working. But if He's intervening all the time during the test and giving you answers, you're not growing. You're not getting more faithful. So just remember, hardships do not equal abandonment. If you're going to be a real warrior for God, you're going to have hardships. They're going to happen. But those don't mean God has abandoned you. Maybe you're paying for a stupid mistake, or maybe it's a test. Maybe God wants you to be successful at the test. Faithful at the test. And you can't give me the answers all the time. Otherwise, you won't be successful in your faith. Here's another parallel between the story of Gideon and the story of our lives as warriors. We've got to rely on God's strength through our own strength. We've got to rely on God's strength through our own strength. If you look at verse 14, the Lord turned to Gideon and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" So the Lord was sending Gideon in his own strength. But it really wasn't his own strength because God owned his body, God owned his life, so it was really God's strength. Are we being warriors in God's strength? Just like Gideon had to be a warrior in God's strength. Are you in the Word? Are you in prayer? Are you having accountability with other Christians? Are you living in community with other Christians so you can live in God's strength when you're becoming a warrior, when you're trying to defend your heart and soul, when you're trying to fight for your heart and soul every day? Are you putting on that armor of God that Ephesians 6 talks about? Because if you try to fight this war every day on your own strength, you're going to fail epically. All the time. So remember, if God is sending you to be a warrior, you can do this in His strength. You don't have to do it in your own strength. Here's the last parallel we see. If you're going to be a warrior for God, you have to eliminate excuses. You have to eliminate excuses. There's a difference between an excuse and a reason. In verse 15, Gideon has an excuse for the Lord's commissioning for him to defeat the Midianites. Verse 15 says, "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. God does not want your excuses when you're a warrior. This reminds me of when Moses had 9,000 excuses. Remember when he encountered God in the burning bush? Well, God, I can't speak well. God, do you remember where I've been? Moses had every excuse in the book. You've got to remember, there's a difference between an excuse and a reason. I was on the website of a restaurant consulting company, and they had a good difference between an excuse and a reason. They even gave some examples of excuses and some examples of reasons. Here's what an excuse is. An excuse is an explanation for why something is the way it is, but you're always putting the blame on something else or someone else. That's what an excuse is. It's an explanation for why something is the way it is, but you're throwing the buck on somebody else, or you're always throwing the buck on something else. This is what a reason is. A reason is an explanation for why something is the way it is, but everybody is taking responsibility for their own actions. Excuses give an explanation, but it's an explanation where you're throwing the buck on everybody else, or you're throwing the buck on something else. A reason is explaining why something is the way it is, but everybody is being held accountable for their own actions, and everybody is taking responsibility for their own actions. Here are some examples of excuses. Our employees were stealing from us. Our purveyors were cheating us. Our concept was too progressive for the market. The market didn't appreciate good food. Our landlord was unreasonable. Here's some reasons. We didn't have a reliable system for evaluating good help, and we didn't supervise our employees as effectively as we could have, so we lost a lot of money from theft. We didn't know anything about negotiating purchasing and ended up paying prices we couldn't afford to pay. You notice how there are people taking responsibility for their actions here versus the few other scenarios I was talking about not too long ago? You've got to know the difference between excuses and reasons. Because if you can't own your actions, you're not going to own your faith. You can't take ownership for your actions. You're not going to take ownership for your faith. If you are drowning in excuses, you're creating a lot of good reasons why you're not a good Christian. You can't give God your excuses. He doesn't accept your excuses. He's with you. He's going to equip you to fight the battle. And when we put all these realities into practice about being a warrior, we come to find out that we're living a life of sacrifice and service. Our lives are an altar of sacrifice and service. If you look at the end of this scenario of Gideon and the angel of the Lord, we see that Gideon built an altar to the Lord after this encounter with the angel. Let's look at verse 24. So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, "The Lord is Peace." To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So once Gideon understood what it meant to be a warrior for God, he understood the greatness of God. He understood the great position he had for God. And out of his praise and out of his worship and out of his adoration, he made an altar to the Lord that meant the Lord's peace. If you're a real warrior for God, where you're fighting for your heart and soul every day, where you're not making excuses, where you're letting God define your potential, where you're relying on God's strength, your life is going to be an altar that says the Lord is peace. You're going to be living a life where you're preaching the Lord is peace because your life is an altar, because your life represents sacrifice and service as a warrior to God. Because when you're a Christian, you may have peace, but peace means war. When you're a Christian, peace means war. There was a man named Charles Spurgeon, who was a famous preacher. He said this: "Will you think me odd if I say that our Lord came to give us peace, that He might send us out to war?" So living your life as an altar, as a word for God, is peace, but it's also war, because you're fighting a war every day. Be that warrior for God. Live a life of sacrifice and service. That's worship to God. Through the way you live your life, through the way you interact with other people, through the way you let God intervene in your everyday life. Would you guys pray? Dear Heavenly